I was happily in the middle of writing about the application of textual narrative POV terminology, first, second, third person, to non text works when Trump began his extortion racket against Ukraine. I couldn't keep going. This was too important. I had to write about it. But I also knew I was too emotional about it in the moment to talk about it coherently. So I've had to wait several days for my mind to simmer down. It's not easy seeing your hopes for a more righteous world go up in flames, so you'll have to forgive me for showing weakness here. Regardless of exactly what deal ends up being worked out between Trump, Putin, Zelensky, and the Europeans, the fact there isn't a unified leadership for them I can name alongside the other three is part of the problem, actually. It's the attitude that signals the sea change. Trump only cares about the war insofar as he promised to end it and wants to look like Mr. Dealmaker again by getting it done ASAP, and insofar as he can use the leverage the US possesses over Ukraine to enrich the United States. After all, his slogan has always been America First, and now he's actually living that motto. Well, except possibly regarding Israel. We'll need to see how the Gaza shit plays out. He saw an opportunity to extort another country for resources and didn't even hesitate. The same way he sees Mexican and Canadian economic dependence upon the United States as leverage and has bombarded them with seemingly perpetual tariff threats if they don't do whatever he wants them to do. He isn't just saying that he puts American interests, American wealth, American gain first. He's actually operating on that principle now, unlike in his first term where it really was an empty slogan supported only by his rhetoric and not his actions. The reason this fundamentally shatters my hope for the future is the USA is the only country that can actually enforce liberal values around the planet, because it is the only major liberal military power. Thus, my hopes for the survival of many vulnerable democracies around the planet involved some degree of benevolent intervention by the United States, as these countries, Finland, the Baltics, Taiwan, South Korea, cannot survive against their tyrannical neighbors on their own. If the US refuses to act in such a manner, if the Americans install a nationalist president, and their president is de facto an elected dictator when it comes to foreign policy, who is only interested in enriching the United States and in no higher moral purpose than that, then such hopes are utterly pointless. If the Americans truly cared that much about the rest of the world, they would not have put a hardcore nationalist like Trump in charge of their country again. Yet they did. Even if someone like Vance does not end up succeeding Trump, even if the next president is a Democrat, the fact most relevant voters, by which I mean those who did not vote third party like idiots, voted for him means the Americans cannot be trusted to remain an ally in the long term. Since FDR, the US has always acted as an ally and a lifeline to democratic countries, unless they voted for communists. But the American electorate has finally turned against that paradigm. At the very least, enough to not care that Trump himself definitely has. Trump talked a lot in his first term about how he felt Europe was ripping us off. His primary concern was always the expense the US was making for Europe's benefit. And being a nationalist, Trump obviously doesn't really care about Europe. You can see it in his language about it now. How there's a big, beautiful ocean between the US and Europe, so why should he care? It seems that so long as the Russians don't build a giant fleet and set off to invade Greenland, he really doesn't give a damn about what goes on beyond the Atlantic. As of when I'm writing this, there's a rumor floating around that he plans to disband AFRICOM, showing he cares about Africa even less and furthering my point. When you combine this indifference to Europe, his seeming preparation to pull out of Africa, wanting to draw down American forces in Europe, cede the Ukraine issue to the Russians so he doesn't have to keep spending money on it, insisting Europe spend much more on their own defense, on the one hand, with his comparatively interested focus on backyard issues like eliminating the Mexican cartels annexing Canada for economic and manifest destiny reasons. I mean, he literally thinks it would make the US look big and cool on a map. Annexing Greenland for explicitly geostrategic military purposes and economic ones. There's resources there Denmark is not exploiting, but he very much would like to. And saying he's going to take back the Panama Canal because it's been sold out to the Chinese, on the other hand. It would seem that he may be trying to resurrect the Monroe Doctrine and all the corollaries that go with that. He seems to share Putin's 19th century mindset in that regard, one of spheres of influence, balance of power, and rank imperial domination of each sphere by a great power. It's a mentality that perfectly aligns with his nationalist rhetoric, and very much does put America first. But it also means any hope I had of a united democratic world going forward is utterly and completely dead. Europe will not trust the Americans again unless, in all likelihood, they go through another World War II style cataclysm that seals their pact in blood again. And the existence of nuclear weapons ensures that such a war will never happen again, which means that trust is not coming back. What I would have previously referred to as the West is now inevitably divided between the United States on one side and the EU on the other, with the Americans choosing to enact a selfish foreign policy and the Europeans having no choice but to respond in kind. Obviously, I do not relish this turn of events whatsoever. I don't want to see smaller democratic countries crushed by tyrants because no one else cares to save them. I don't want to see democratic countries fight amongst each other because they're now pursuing their own national interests alone rather than acting in a more global context. But the Americans were the linchpin to that ever happening. And with them choosing the opposite path, that dream of mine is dead. So I can either wallow in lament and despair and throw up my hands, say it's over, and check out of foreign affairs, or I can accept that this is the world I now live in and think about how to navigate it. The former may feel more righteous, but it's totally pointless. I have no power to make the Americans follow my moral commandments. All I can do is evaluate how to deal with their new attitude. One caveat to consider before I continue is that all the drama so far has been around Europe. We still don't know if it also applies to Asia. A lot of the people around Trump, most notably Vance, have been advocating for what is essentially a more nationalist version of what Obama claimed he was going to do in pivoting towards facing down China, which is a strategy I myself have advocated for. Now, if that's what's actually happening, then as tactless, amoral, and cruel as Trump's method of accomplishing it may be, I can at least say I did get what I wanted to some extent. But it remains to be seen. Even if people around Trump may want to confront China, it's possible Trump himself may not. It's possible he may truly believe in letting everyone play in their own sandbox, claiming the Americas as his while leaving Europe as Putin's and Asia as Xi's, until the focus of his diplomacy shifts away from Europe, which won't happen until the Ukraine war is over with. That will remain an open question. The dynamic within the Americas, however, will be the same either way, so I'll ignore the Pacific question for now. Now, Canada is in a bind. The break between us and the Americans due to Trump's tariff blackmail shows that no, we're not entirely just a clone of the United States, similar as we might be. Our politics are a bit more similar to Europe, and it's no wonder that in the wake of Trump's threat, people are openly floating the idea of Canada joining the EU. The thing is, we're not Mongolia. Mongolia can play Russia and China off each other to its own benefit. It is sandwiched between them. We are stuck on the same continent as the United States with an ocean between us and Europe. From the point of view of someone who believes in spheres of influence, which Trump does, Canada, no matter its differences with it, will never be seen as outside the American sphere of influence purely due to location. Like a mega Greenland, our physical location is critical to American national defense posture. Canadians don't seem to realize that, like Greenland and Iceland, we are a satellite of the United States, not some strong independent country who don't need no man. We basically don't have a military. Denmark demilitarized what little of a military it had to supply Ukraine, and Iceland doesn't even have one. All three of us are basically autonomous civilian administration for what the Americans otherwise treat as a giant military installation. The only reason any of us still exist is because the Americans have simply never cared to directly annex our territory. That's literally it. Only their goodwill towards us has kept us as independent civilian states. Given that, and given that we are separated from Europe physically and therefore economically, we are inevitably tied to the United States. Before the US had a military presence here, back when we were a colony of another great power, Canada being tied to Europe rather than the USA was a real thing, but not anymore. Barring some kind of internal collapse that leads to the complete abandonment of any American military base outside their own territory, the Americans are never going to leave and allow us to be put under the sway of some other power, even if Europe does, against all odds, rise up and become one. It's for that reason that, ironically, I think Trump's offer of making Canada a state is actually one we should consider. I know, I can see the crucifix being prepared already, but just stow the seethe and just listen for a fucking minute. You need to think about this from a strategic perspective. As it is, the Americans have the advantage over us economically. They can dictate terms. We do have the ability to bite back, but it can never be proportionate in effect due to the vast difference in size between us. They can survive without us, we cannot survive without them, and they know that. So instead of being dictated to by the Americans, with the Americans always positioning to get themselves a better deal than we do, why not be part of that team? We're literally being offered a chance to partake in whatever benefits American economic nationalism will reap them, and even if those may be hampered by Trump's own stupidity and lack of economic knowledge, it's better than suffering under his whims without any say in the matter. Think about it. Even if admitted just as one state, which would obviously be a cynical ploy to keep the Senate Republican, it would be like adding a second California to the United States. The Senate would be skewed Republican, but the House and the presidency would be skewed Democratic by such an annexation. More intelligent Republicans have argued against annexing Canada for precisely that reason, but of course Trump is dumb and just likes how it looks on a map, and that's as far as he's thought about it. If he were actually serious and could actually bully red states into agreeing to it, fuck it. I say take it. Take it all the way. Let them vote in a gigantic blue state. That is a fantastic idea if you're anywhere left of center politically. But naturally, no, Canadians are too reflexively anti-American to see how much of an own goal this would be for Trump if he actually did it. Instead of actually trying to make it happen, only to make him regret it later, the response is the usual, we're not American, Canada #1, fuck you, which I understand as an emotional reaction, but is not any kind of intelligent strategy, because it's just going to lead to us getting fucked over. Now, to be clear, my endorsement of this idea relies on the idea we actually become a state. Under no circumstances should we ever agree to become North Puerto Rico, as Trump seems to want to do to Greenland. Greenland has far more reason to be wary of and seek protection against the Americans for that reason, and it's why Trump wanting to annex Greenland offends me far more than his offer to make Canada a state. Offering statehood is equitable and fair. Offering to become a territory, so a colony, is neither. But in terms of what is good for Canada, if such a proposal is serious, I actually fully support becoming a US state. The idea Canada is some truly independent country that can operate independently of the US is a fucking fairy tale that Canadians tell themselves because they don't want to accept reality. I'm not saying your attitude is wrong. I'm not saying you have to like the US, but you need to be cognizant of where you are. If you actually want to get away from the US, if you don't want to be American or hitch your wagon to the Americans, you can't stay in Canada. You need to leave for Europe. Because the reality is that Canada is a satellite state of the United States, and that's not changing no matter how much you protest it. If, as I am, you have no intention of leaving this country at the moment, then you need to consider what will actually serve best the people who live in this piece of territory, and with the US returning to great power politics, the answer is that sadly, we can't beat them, so we should take any offer to join them. And for the record, I never did think Canada would survive as an independent country in the long run. It has no raison d'etre and exists purely at the pleasure of the United States. It's not on a stable foundation for long-term survival. I figured at some point it would be annexed by the USA. I just didn't think I'd be arguing for it to happen in my lifetime. I didn't think the time for it would come this soon. We seem to live in interesting times.